Okay, we're in Hebrews chapter 13. Just by way of recap, the welcome of the new covenant carries a warning. We looked at that. So we are in verse 1 of chapter 13. Okay, let's get to it. Can I have someone who does really good reading out loud like Terry? I'm just kidding. I'm joking. Shoo-wee. Did you see that? I thought I was going to get murdered just now. It's a joke. It's just a joke. Chris, would you mind reading this?
Yes, you would. Or yes, you would. No. Let brotherly love continue. Don't neglect to show hospitality, for by doing this, some have welcomed angels as guests without knowing it. Remember those in prison as though you were in prison with them, and the mistreated as though you yourselves were suffering bodily. Marriage is to be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept undefiled, because God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterers. Keep your life free from the love of money. Be satisfied with what you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you or abandon you. Therefore, we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me?
All right, so as we're getting into chapter 13, I guess you could say criticism or whatever is brought up. Was Hebrews 13 part of the original document? Was it a part of the original book of Hebrews? And to that, I'm just going to give you a very brief answer to that, okay? First, there is absolutely no proof whatsoever that Hebrews 13 was not an original part of the book of Hebrews. So anytime you hear these people, they're called revisionists. Anytime you hear these people talking about these criticisms of, remember to kind of take with a grain of salt. There's probably not much to it. The second point I want to make about this is Hebrews 13 really fits with the rest of the book. It just fits. And I'll just very briefly, its vocabulary fits with the rest of the book. Seems like it's written by the same person who has the same vocabulary. The Old Testament references and quotations kind of seem to fit right along with the rest of the book. The concepts that are introduced, or the themes, however you want to say that, they very much so flow from one another. They fit there too. The argument styles that we've grown accustomed to the last 12 chapters of Hebrews, they're still here and they still fit. And then the structure of the book, 13, really fits in nicely with the structure. And then the style, once again, like if you're reading poetry, right? You can tell poetry. You can pretty much flip anywhere in Hamlet and kind of know that you're in Shakespeare, right? It's just that terrible poetry style. You just know you're there. And it's kind of the same thing with this. It's written in that same style. So getting onto the book, let's hop to verse 1. Hebrews 13:1 says, "Let brotherly love continue." This is a little bit of a jarring verse here, because if you remember last week, the end of chapter 12, we were talking about how God is a consuming fire. So we go straight from God is a consuming fire to let brotherly love continue. It's like, ugh, how does that fit with this? And before I answer that, notice how it says let brotherly love continue. So this is something that it was there. It was just being kind of tried, and people were kind of, like they do when they're going through times of duress, kind of backing off of loving. So our love for brothers flows from God's supremacy. It's not something where we're just trying to be a good human, but because of our relationship with God and the fact that God is a consuming fire and we're correcting our relationship with Him, therefore let brotherly love continue. It flows from that. It's part of the same vein, if you will. It's a natural progression. Another thing that I want to mention before we move on to verse 2 is that in this part, and really all throughout the book, I shouldn't say this part, really all of Hebrews has shown God as the Father and we as brothers. This has been kind of a recurring theme. It's really throughout the whole book. And you guys often probably hear it in the world out there, not just on Facebook, but I mean when you're talking with people and not, the idea of how humanity is all one, right? We're all brothers, oneness of humanity. But that's not really what the Bible teaches. Yes, we're all one in the sense that we're all humans. And like we're all equal in that sense. But from a religious standpoint, we're called not to be like the people in our lifestyle. So here is a good example of this. We're not all children of God, but rather those who have been adopted in are the children of God. So it sets up this nice little family unit here. Verse 2 continues on with, don't neglect to show hospitality, for by doing this, some have welcomed angels as guests without knowing it. So again, this is something I really feel like I've been harping on, but it's a really important point that that is absolutely essential to point out here. Love is not an emotion; it's an action. Again, we see it here. Just said, let brotherly love continue, and now he's going to say about some ways that that's going to apply. And the very first one he talks about is hospitality. In all of these examples he's going to give, an action is going to be primary, not just a feeling. Okay, you'd be surprised how often I hear people say things along the lines of, "Well, that's going to be a rabbit trail, so I'm just going to reel it back in." So the idea here, you might hear people say, "I love my wife, but I'm going to cheat," and they don't say it just like that. They say it like this: "I love my wife, I'm not in love with my wife." It's like, I don't think that means what you think it means. So I think what they're talking about is they're trying to distinguish, feelings and stuff, and I get what they're trying to say, but it just doesn't really, doesn't fit with the definition of love. Then we get to the idea here of hospitality. Now this is something that maybe isn't as, maybe that's not true, but it seems like it's not as big as it used to be. Well, let me just kind of explain how it was back then. In the ancient world, to be hospitable, to invite somebody into your house, wasn't just to invite them into your house. It was to invite them into fellowship. You were inviting them to be inviting them basically to join into your family, at least for a limited time. And as they were brought into your house, they were brought under your care. You were now their servant. As they are your guest in your house, you became their servant. Not in the sense that you might be thinking of like a slave, but I'm talking about like in the sense of it was your duty and your responsibility to take care of them. So kind of think of Lot in Sodom, where he even sacrificed his own children for the sake of being hospitable. Which once again I've talked about that before, so I don't really want to spend too much time on that tonight. But some other points to make is that inns at the time were very costly, which actually isn't that much different from nowadays. But the difference being that people didn't have, credit cards and, so we're not going to talk about the finances of the ancient world. But the moral of the story being it was a little bit different of a situation back then. Also, the inns of the time had very bad reputations. Maybe more like a Motel 6 nowadays. There's probably going to be cockroaches, Well, back then it was kind of like that, except not just with the cockroaches, also with the, bad things happening in them. So for it to be hospitable wasn't just, they've got other options, but we're just trying to save them a penny. You are saving them, and you're also trying to bring them into fellowship, but also you're providing something that they were not really able to get themselves. Also, there's the obvious points that there's no Walmarts or convenience stores back then, so it would have been very difficult for them. Then it gets us part of this verse where it says, "For by doing this, some have welcomed angels as guests without knowing it." Now, I overlooked this because especially when I was a kid, because I was like, I don't really know what we're talking about here. But there's at least 3 examples of this happening in the Bible. There's obviously Abraham, when the angels are getting ready to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. That obviously everybody thinks about that one, right? And then there's Lot, where he tries to, be hospitable to the angels. Obviously, pretty much the same story. A little bit later in the same story. But a third example that is oftentimes overlooked is Gideon, when he's being called to be a judge, and he offers the sacrifice, and the angel consumes it with fire, and he says, "Oh, I did not realize this was this intense of a situation." And it goes on from there. So verse 3 goes on with, "Remember those in prison, as though you were in prison with them, and the mistreated as though you yourselves were suffering bodily." So there's so many different things with this. This verse, though, and I think you guys probably have heard this before, kind of used as a reason why we should do prison ministry. But that's not really what it's talking about here. First off, it says, remember them. Remember them. Remember those in prison. One of the easiest things to do, there's a fable, and I can't remember exactly how it goes. I bet you my kids would know how it goes. But the basic idea is that there's somebody drowning in the water, and a guy is standing on the shore, and he's basically telling him, how he could have avoided the situation, how he could get out of the situation being drowned, and doesn't do anything to actually help the man who's drowning. And the point of the story is, when there's somebody in need, you actually help them. But I think it's just something we naturally do, that we try to counsel the hurting and tell them how they should feel and think, rather than actually being there for them in their suffering. And so this verse here, remember those in prison. Don't counsel and nag those in prison. Remember those in prison. And obviously, another thing that I used to misunderstand with this verse is, so I used to think that it was saying, you either take care of the world or you take care of the church. See what I mean? So like basically in churches are divided into two easy segments. There's this church here that cares for its community, but really doesn't have much of a family life. Then there's this one here that only cares for those who are already involved in its church and doesn't care about the community at all. And I definitely, now that I've gotten older and, well, let's just say older, I don't think that's what it's talking about at all. Yes, you should not neglect the world, but don't neglect one another either. A good example of this would be those affected by the floods, right? So we should probably care for those in the church that need help from the flood, right? And also we should care for the people of Roswell, yeah. But I mean, yeah, we shouldn't neglect those in the church. And I think that's exactly what's going on here too. Remember those in prison. Not that you shouldn't be witnessing to your city, but remember those among you who have gotten arrested as though you were in prison with them, and the mistreated as though you yourselves were suffering bodily. So then he says in prison, and I just want to clarify a few things. He's not saying, not that we shouldn't go and witness to people who are in prison who have done wrong and been arrested for their wrongdoing. That's fine, but that's not what he's talking about here. What he's talking about here are the Christians who had been imprisoned for doing the right thing. They were being punished by the government for doing the wrong thing. So we're not talking about prison ministry in general, not that we shouldn't do prison ministry, but he's talking specifically about those believers who had been arrested. So remember those who are going through these times of trials. Remember those Christians who are suffering. And then he goes on to say, and the mistreated as though yourselves. And so just basically think of it like this. In prison is more of a specific thing, but mistreated is kind of like various degrees of suffering generally. And there's also another little point that I feel like we miss a lot of times in the Western world. Prison was brutal back then. Like it was not a good place. Nowadays you get cable and you get all kinds of fun stuff. I mean, it's like, ooh, you're going to pay my bills and give me food. Now, I'm making light of it, but, there's a lot better. It's a lot easier to be in prison nowadays than it was in the ancient world. I think maybe people who've been to prison in, a third world country might know a little bit more about what I'm talking about here. But anyways. So then he says, as though you yourselves were suffering bodily, an idea here, which I don't think comes across in English at all, but so I'll just put it kind of in my wordings. Care for them as if you were with them, experiencing the same thing at the same time with them. You're there in prison with them. So it's a little bit different, a little more expressive than it comes across in English, as though you yourselves were suffering bodily. It's more than that. It's as though you are with them in prison. You're going through the same things. And so once again, we get the idea of caring with action, not just emotions or words. And there's a lot of times you hear people say, oh, I care. But then their actions don't really match up. So let's not care for people with our words alone, right? Let's care for people with our actions. So Hebrews 13:4 goes on to say, marriage is to be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept undefiled. Lots of good stuff here. We're going to have to break this down because there's a lot of good stuff here. But because God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterers. So what are the sexually immoral? What are the adulterers? What's going on here? So let's break it down into smaller pieces. First off, it says marriage is to be honored. The idea of honored here is, that's a pretty good idea. Maybe some other words will kind of give a fuller idea. Respected. Precious, seeing it as of great worth, having excessive value. So it has something that has great worth. Treat it with care. Maybe an object lesson would be a little bit better. Imagine you're carrying a piece of glass. You carry it very carefully, very carefully. It's the idea of preciousness to it. And there was the idea at this time, and it's come back in smaller groups throughout the ages. But the idea is that marriage doesn't matter. That somehow people who are married are less saved or less holy. That if you're really saved, you're closer with God. You won't get married, and you'll be able to be self-sufficient, and your spouse will just kind of drag you down. And I don't think that that's a healthy mindset to have, especially when it says here, just like that, marriage is to be honored. It's something that's not to be looked down on. And the idea was back then was, okay, if I'm married, I'm going to abstain from sex, and that's going to make me more righteous and acceptable to God, which is not what you should do. As a married couple, you should not do that. And then other people were saying, well, I'm not going to get married, and then that's going to make me basically more worthy to God. And obviously, there are pros and cons to being married and staying single, but that's definitely not what that means. Then it says, and the marriage bed kept undefiled. Obviously, marriage bed, we're all adults here. It's talking about intimacy, the sexuals. An extremely important part. What a time to walk back into the room, am I right? It's obviously an extremely important part of marriage, which you wouldn't know because a lot of the times you'd be surprised how often. Let me say it like this: how often I talk to people who are having marriage conflict, and the root of the issue is that these married people are abstaining, and that's the root of the problem. If you're married, go at it. Like, for goodness sake, stop depraving, stop withholding from each other. You'd be surprised how many times that's all that needs to be resolved in that marriage. And I know this may be awkward for some of you, but I'm telling you, it would save so much time and conversations if married people would just take the time to connect with each other. This is something that God made us for. It's something we're supposed to be doing. But yet we do this thing and it's like we all have our different reasons. Like sometimes it'll be like, oh, well, I'm mad at them or whatever, which is a stupid reason for that. That's all the more reason why you should do it. We're all married here. Well, a lot of us are married here. You know what I'm talking about. Where it's just a lot of stupid reasons for doing that. And when you do that, not only are you opening yourself up for having more marital conflicts and fights, but also you're opening yourself up for just tempting yourself. For goodness sakes. You're just going to... So many different problems can just be avoided. Don't do that. Don't withhold from one another. Indulge one another as much as you can. Life is definitely too short to be... to not be enjoying the marriage life, and all that entails. Go for a walk. Go have fun. Go have dinner together. So then it goes to, because God will judge the sexually immoral. Oh, I'm sorry. I wrote myself a note here. Abstaining from marriage or sex in the marriage doesn't make you better than another. It doesn't make you more honored. Rather, it says here, marriage is to be honored. And all of that entails. So now we can get to here these two key words here. Now, in English, they translate to sexually immoral and adulterers. So this is the contrast to pure. And all the marriage bed kept undefiled or pure. And so this is going to be the contrast of something that, instead of being pure, this is the opposite of that. Because God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterers. So the first one, immoral, it comes from a word pornoi, which sounds awful familiar, doesn't it? Pornoi? Yes, exactly. It comes from that same idea of pornography. Same root word there. And the idea of this, and I am drastically simplifying this conversation for good reason, but here it is. The basic idea of pornoi is extramarital sexual experience. That's it. Okay, let's not make this too complicated. Let's just make it simple. And then morkoi translates to adulterers. And the idea of that is basically you're betraying your vows. So if you put them together, we can kind of summarize a few things of maybe modern day equivalents. And a lot of times people will say, well, what about homosexuality? Are people, now that homosexual is legal, is it still wrong? And when you look at this, it's hard to justify homosexual marriage in a verse like this. It's just very hard to do it. You'd be surprised how well they twist Scripture to do other things, but when you look at verses like this, it's very, very difficult to try and justify that. So basically, when you take these two words together, we can kind of get some blanket ideas. Pornography is a big no-no, although not necessarily masturbation. Cheating is a big no-no. Homosexuality, bestiality, incest, all these different ideas here. And I'll give you another one that maybe we don't see very much in America, but is still a thing. And that's having a side thing, for when you need a little bit more. You know what I'm saying? And that can look like your marriage might have been arranged, which is still a thing in parts of the world, and you're still doing that, but you kind of not really into each other, so you kind of have to have your own wall. Or sometimes more political relationships, or things where you're staying together for tax reasons and different stuff like that, and then just kind of we're in name we're married, but we still have we're not really. We have an open marriage. Those kinds of things, definitely you can't justify that when you're looking at parts like this. And once again, some of those ideas are more dominant in other areas than here, but, might as well mention them. Sex and all that is good in the marriage context. Is only for husband and wife, and that is pure. It's not something that's dirty or gross. It's something that's pure for them. I think we covered all those different aspects there, so we can move on to verse 5, which says, "Keep your life free from the love of money. Be satisfied with what you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you or abandon you." Very powerful verse. It's interesting to me that coveting and sexual immorality, that they are connected if you remember in the Ten Commandments, they're listed side by side. Here they're listed side by side, verses 4, verse 5. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. I think, first off, they're both very self-focused. When you're talking about greed and when you're talking about sexual immorality, they're both very self-focused. The second thing is they're both very short-term focused. Rather than the long-term, even the eternal in many aspects, it's all about here and now. And then also I think that they both come from the same root. When you are sexually immoral and when you're greedy, like in this money bit here he's talking about, in both situations you're discontent. You're not content with what you have. You're looking for more, for something greater. And a lot of times you'd be surprised how many married people are looking at porn actively. I mean, even to the extent that some of the people that I talk to are looking at porn together as a married couple to try and rejuvenate their, intimate life. And behind it all is that same root of not being content. And also related to that is a poor self-worth, not just as a person, but as a child of God. And I'll get to that in just a second. And also kind of the insatiable hunger and greed. And if you read through the story of the prodigal son, which we're going to be spending a lot of time on that in December, but you'll remember the part where the son goes to the dad and says, basically, give me your money. And it's that same kind of thing. Was the dad a bad provider? Why did he need to do that? And, he wasn't content. He wanted more. And, I think that we can all kind of have times in our lives when we look back and see, well, yeah, there's been times that I was having this big issue with God, and my main issue was that I saw God as a poor provider. I was criticizing him. God, I don't have enough money. I don't have enough of this. I don't have this. And complaining to God, like, God, why don't you give me these things? The whole time it's like, well, maybe God has given us what we need, and we need to rather adjust our expectations, adjust our desires, our wants. And I think that applies to marriage too. There's a lot of times that where as a married couple, you just have to come to a point and say, no, this is my spouse. We're married. I'm staying faithful to this person, and we're going to work through this. And that's just how this is going to go. It is really easy to just let a little kernel of something in your thought and then in your heart, and it just kind of spirals on from there. So anyways, moving on. And the idea that God doesn't know what he's doing. And I think that we do that with our spouses too. What on earth was I thinking marrying this person, So, and there's a little bit of a contrast here that I missed until literally this week. I was restudying this for tonight. And this was the very first time I saw this. Look at the contrast here. Keep your life from the love of money. Be satisfied with what you have. What you have, that's more than just money, isn't it? See the contrast there between money and what you have. And this is why I bring this up, is because people say something like this. I know money is not going to make me happy, but if I just had a little bit more money, I wouldn't have to worry about fill in the blank, whatever it is. Well, I don't. You hear especially this next generation saying this a lot. It's not that I love money. It's not that I want money all the time. It's just that I want to not have to worry about this. I just want enough to get the things that I want. It's like, so that's the love of money. The love of money isn't just wanting the money itself. It's also wanting the effects of the money. It's kind of once again, kind of a blanket term. So here you see a contrast between the love of money versus being content. So rather than don't love gain, don't love money, don't love profit, don't love what money can buy, rather be content with what you have. And in that sense, money is just a tool. It isn't evil. It's not bad. A lot of times people misquote this verse to me. Oh, actually, you'd be surprised how often they do this. There's a couple of things that as a pastor you hear quite a lot. One is that pastors don't pay tithes, which is not true. We do pay tithes. And that we have access to the money. We're just like in the back rolling around it or something. And then the other thing that you hear quite a bit is this whole, well, you know, pastors they rob people. They get paid from the church, and they're just like swimming in dough. All that they do is work one day a week, and which, once again, isn't true. And, you know, the Bible says that the money is evil. And it's like, okay, let's take it down a notch there. First off, I don't have unlimited access to the money. There's that. Second off, that's pretty much none of that is true. But what the Bible actually says is the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, not the root of all evil. So little points that are worth bringing up, I guess. So our love for money is what kind of brings us to sin. Think about politicians. I mean, this is a great example, right? They don't just get all the money to have the money. They get the money, and sometimes they do some corrupt things with it. Not all of them, but there are some. So, let's see what else we want to say about this verse. I've noticed that in my life, there are sins that I think that I don't really struggle with that much. But if I stop and really think about it, yeah. You know, like idolatry, right? We would all say, well, I don't struggle with idolatry. But then there's a part, and I was just reading it this last week, where Paul says, how does he say it? He says, and greed, which is idolatry. And it's like, oh, well then. And I think there's always times when we look at maybe somebody else's house or somebody else's, you know, family or somebody else's, you know, fill in the blank of whatever. It doesn't have to be physical belongings, but there's always times in our lives when we look at what somebody else has and we just say, man, I wish I just had that. And there's a little bit of greed that comes up. Why couldn't my life have gone that way? Why couldn't that have happened? And so oftentimes I've noticed that in my own life, my prayers have become focused on greed rather than God's kingdom. And here's a good example. Heal me so that I can live my life. And there's nothing wrong with God healing. That's a great thing. There's nothing wrong with wanting God to heal you. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you're all in life is, I don't want more of God. I don't want to know God more. I don't want God to sustain me. I don't want to have to be dependent on God. All I want in life is just for God to heal me so I can move on with my life. This is something that I actually hear quite a bit, and that's just not really a prayer according to God's will. So when you say things like, I'm going to pray this prayer and I'm just going to tack on in the name of Jesus at the end, that's not the idea of praying in the name of Jesus, rather praying according to his wills and his desires and his authority. So if I'm praying for something, it's not that God doesn't desire to heal me. It's that God's primary purpose in my life is not for me to be happy in the temporary. It's for me to be eternally happy. See what I mean? And sometimes that includes miracles here and now, but that's not the end-all and be-all. So health and money is not going to bring us contentment. It's just going to bring us different problems. I was actually reading online, and there was this guy that was saying, you know, I don't want to be super rich. I just want to have enough problems and not have to worry about my rent anymore. And I told him, I said, money never makes somebody not worry. Money never removes worry and problems. All it does is gives you different worries. I have been very poor in California, and I've been less poor, and I've been almost rich in New Mexico when my dad was kind of making a lot of money in construction. You know, I've been different stages, you know, in the financial scheme of things, and never once did I see me or my parents not have something to worry about. It just never happened. When you don't have money, you think you need to get money, so you strive to get money. When you have money, you want to keep your money safe, and so you fight to keep your money. It's a never-ending cycle of just not being happy. So, okay, let's recap this verse here of what we've been looking at, because I kind of talked about a couple different things. Keep your life free from the love of money. Be satisfied with what you have, for he himself has said he's going to drop this in on us. I will never leave you or abandon you. So how can we be content? How can we be content? Because God will be with us. Our needs will be met. Maybe not our wants, but our needs. So then he says this verse here. For he has said, and it has this verse in here, I will never leave you or abandon you. Who can tell me where that verse comes from? Answer, nowhere. It doesn't come from anywhere. It is not. It's not. Let me reword that. It's kind of a conglomeration of verses. There's a bunch of different verses that are kind of similar to this one. He just kind of seems to have summarized about 10 different verses and made them into one verse and dropped it in there. So if you go and look for this exact thing, you're not really going to find it anywhere. But you're going to find a whole lot of verses that are near misses, a swing and a miss. So then we get to verse 6, and it says this. Therefore, we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Very good verse. We may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? This is our boldness. So in the face of persecution that they're facing, and church tension that they're facing, and marriage difficulties that they're facing, and the needs that they're facing, in the midst of all of that, he has this quote from Psalm 118, verses 6 through 7. The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? And you might think, well, hold on. What if it's not man that I'm concerned with? Maybe it's the situation. Well, remember that these two verses are touching, and they're kind of meet together here. Both of these verses from verse 6 and verse 5, where he says, I will never leave you or abandon you. The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? They meet together here. They're married, if you will. And they're kind of carrying through the basic idea. And the reason why he's doing this is because he's going to switch focus in this last section to authority leader, to people in authority, and so it's kind of a two-way thing here. First off, what if my authority in the government is what's abusing me, like the Christians who are in prison? But also, that's going to be a perfect segue to talk about their relationship with authority in the last section, which goes from like 7 to maybe like 19 or something like that. So the main idea here, whatever happens, God will see us through it. You take both of those verses from verse 5 and verse 6, and you put them together. That's the main idea we're left with. Whatever happens, God will see us through it. And this verse here from Psalm 118, is actually a verse about the plans of the wicked being thwarted. So it's kind of an interesting verse, keeping in mind that they are obviously being opposed by different people. So whatever comes, he'll see us through it. I said that. Okay, so since God will be with us, he is our helper, and we will not be afraid. Now, here's something I'm not saying you're not going to have feelings of fear. When I say we will not be afraid, I'm talking about we will not be moved by fear. When you allow fear to have the final say, when you allow fear to move you, it's not when you struggle with a feeling. Feelings are going to come and go. Feelings aren't bad or good, they just are. You have to accept them, you have to wade through them, you have to deal with them, they just are. You're never going to have a moment in life when you don't have feelings. Okay, you're going to have anger, sadness, all this different stuff, fear, doubt, all these different things. Those are feelings. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying we will not be afraid. We will not rest in this place of being afraid, and God's not in control, and I don't know what to do, and I, being moved to not trusting in God and not acting. So the summary of all this, if we take it all and line it all out, I think we can say that these 19 verses, so the next, 13 verses after this, are going to be talking about the same thing as well. The new covenant impacts our relationships. And I think that that's a good way of this next thing. And then after 19 is verses 20 through like 24 or something like that. And it isn't really going to have much to say as far as what the rest of the book was talking about, but it's kind of like a little final things for the churches that it's being circulated to, and we'll talk about that when we get to there. But so if you want to read through that over the next couple weeks, it'll just kind of prepare you for the closing of the book. Are there any questions from what we looked at tonight?